Thank you. We've just had our spring general meeting, which I think took 7 minutes. So I'm going to speak a little bit more slowly at this one. Welcome to all our guests today. I'd like to take the opportunity to give you a few housekeeping rules, so either make your mobile phone silent or switch them off for the duration of the meeting. We are being filmed, so your phone will be seen by thousands going off, and your ringtone will be heard by many if you don't turn it off. I'll quickly run through the fire drills, just see where the exits are here at the back. And if there is a fire alarm, and we're not expecting a fire alarm, keep calm. Staff will guide you to the nearest fire exits. I'm now delighted, really am delighted, to read the citation for Professor Clare Gerada, who's giving today's William Pickles lecture. Professor Clare Gerada was the first female chair of the Royal College of GPs in over 50 years. Only the second ever, and the very first chair to come from Malta. Clare is the daughter of Dr. Anthony Gerada and Mrs. Josephine Gerada. Her parents arrived in the UK in 1964 from Nigeria. I'm just trying to work out how they got there from Malta. And her father worked as a GP there. From him, she learnt about the joys and pressures of being a family doctor, and it was not surprising that she followed in his footsteps. Clare studied medicine at University College London, qualifying in 1982. She trained in medicine, then psychiatry, and then became a general practitioner in South London, where she stayed ever since, celebrating her, that's when she's not on TV and on the radio, celebrating her 25th anniversary at the practice in February 2017. The practice started life in 1969 and remains on its current site, the ground floor of a 19-storey housing estate in Lambeth. Clare's training in psychiatry led her to a lifelong interest in managing drug users, and she's advised the Department of Health England on its drug policies. Over the years, Clare has held a number of local and national leadership positions, including Director of Primary Care for the National Clinical Governance Team and Senior Medical Advisor to the Department of Health. In 2008, she won the contract to run the Practitioner's Health Programme, www.php.nhs.uk, a pioneering programme providing confidential services to doctors and dentists with mental health or addiction problems. This service has now expanded to include a service for all GPs in England, meaning that up to 85,000 doctors across England can now access this service. Despite never holding a substantive academic position, Clare has nevertheless published a number of papers, articles, books, chapters on subjects ranging from gambling to periodic psychosis and the menstrual cycle. In between, she has published papers on wide-ranging topics such as smoking and psychosis, random drug testing in schools, and topics relating to practitioner health. Clare has very strong links to 3 Royal Colleges. She's a fellow of the RCGP and the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and was awarded an honorary fellowship at the Royal College of Physicians in 2008. She is currently a nationally elected member on both the RCGP and the British Medical Association councils. Clare was awarded MBE in the Millennium Birthday Honours for services to medicine and substance abuse. She openly admits to being a media tart, able to talk on any subject from why women break wind to more serious topics around the health service. She is a regular contributor to the Day programme, Newsnight, Women's Hour and LBC. Clare's married to a psychiatrist and has 2 sons, one of whom is desperate to change his nationality from British to Maltese. And Clare is helping to get the necessary paperwork together so he can fulfill his wish. She regained her Maltese citizenship in 2017. She now spends her professional time split between working as a frontline GP in her practice and leading on practitioner health. In addition, if you do follow Clare on Twitter, you'll have seen the X-ray of her foot, which shows a stress fracture of her first metatarsal. And you will note that today she is not wearing the approved footwear, an air boot. So we are very pleased that Clare is able to be with us despite her infirmity, and I would now ask Clare to limp to the stage. now call upon Professor Clare Gerada to deliver the 2017 William Pickles Lecture.
And thank you very much. And it's a great honour to be giving this lecture. But before I start, a few thanks. To my late father, who inspired me to be a doctor. To my mother, who taught me courage. To my sons, Alex and Ben, and my husband Simon, for their love and competitiveness. To my family, friends and colleagues, many of you who are in this audience, for putting up with me. To this wonderful Royal College for allowing me to lead you and for your support during those difficult times. And finally, to my patients who have been sustaining, exciting, infuriating, but fundamentally a privilege to serve for the last 35 years. Now, as you've heard, for the last decade, I've been a doctor's doctor, leading a confidential service for doctors with mental health and addiction problems. I've seen and treated thousands of doctors across all specialties and across all ages. Most of them present with depression, anxiety, and symptoms indistinguishable from post-traumatic stress disorder. Doctors with alcohol and drug addiction. Many doctors with bipolar disorder, and a few doctors with schizophrenia and personality disorder. We've even invented a new category called NHS-itis. General practitioners, psychiatrists, and paediatricians are overrepresented in the service. Surgeons, on the other hand, are underrepresented. After all, surgeons never get ill. They get divorced instead. Now, over the years, the numbers of doctors presenting has increased, whilst the average age of those seeking support has dropped dramatically. And in caring for my own kind, I've been trying to understand why I've been seeing a growing number of mentally ill doctors. And in this talk, I'll share with you my personal experience of what I've learnt. And in doing so, we'll suggest, as Julian Tudor Hart did in the 1980s, that we need to train a new kind of doctor. So I'd like to start by telling you about 3 people who've been a massive influence in my life, and all of them general practitioners. I've already mentioned the first, and that's my father. And as you heard, he came to the UK as an immigrant in the 1960s, at a time when the NHS was struggling to cope with an increased workload, an ageing population, and the demands put upon it by a new health service reorganisation. For many years, my father worked as a single-handed GP in the east of England. Our home was his surgery. Our front room doubled up as the patient's waiting room, and our dining room served as his consulting room. And one of my earliest memories is peering down over the banisters and seeing people, mainly women and children, sitting quietly whilst they waited to see my father in the adjoining room. From an early age, I saw firsthand the relationship my dad had with his patients, his dedication, his authority, and his love. When I was a young girl, he would take me out with him on home visits, and I was enthralled as he explained what the house call was about and what was needed to be done. He enthused me with a love of medicine, but much more importantly, though, with a love of general practice. And he impressed upon me how important it was for a good GP to get close to his or her community. The second of my GPs is William Pickles, a founding member and the first president of the council of this college. His career was coming to an end just as my father was starting his. Pickles was a much-loved GP in his North Yorkshire community. He was the archetypal family doctor and regarded by many as a father figure. Early in his career, he too lived above the shop, in the doctor's house with his practice partner, who was an old friend from medical school. Each day, over supper, they would discuss their patients. They were rarely off duty. Pickles was totally dedicated to public service. His work and personal life were so intertwined that there's tales of him even giving away his personal possessions, like shoes and clothes, to his patients. And like my father, he was known for his kindness and his knowledge of his patients. And by the time he died in the 1960s, he'd already become part of this college's and GP's mythology. To these two individuals, I now add a third. He's the subject of a book described by a past president of our college, Iona Heath, as the greatest book ever written about general practice. The late John Burgess wrote A Fortunate Man in 1967, the year my father set up his practice in Peterborough. It was subtitled The Story of a Country Doctor. It's a portrait of Burgess' own GP, Dr. John Sassel. Now, Sassel worked as a country doctor in the Forest of Dean, and Burgess would accompany him on his rounds and in the surgery to produce what we'd call today a fly-on-the-wall account of his life and work. In Burgess' book, Sassel emerges as someone who embodies all that's best about our profession. He's described as a saintly individual, all-knowing, haggard, and accepted by the villagers and foresters as a man who, in the full sense of the term, lives with them. Out of personal stories like these emerges an exemplar of the perfect family doctor to which we can all aspire. Decades later, inspired by my father, I became a GP in South London and have lived and worked in the same place, as you've heard, for over 25 years. I live just a few yards from my practice, and though located in the heart of the inner city, it feels as much to me as my parish as the Yorkshire Dales did for William Pickles, or the Forest of Dean did for John Sassel. Over the years, stories like these have contributed to the folklore of our profession. But is the idea of a self-sacrificing, infallible, dedicated GP anything more than a myth? Are we in danger of looking at the past through rose-tinted spectacles? I believe we are. And I also think that trying to build a future on the foundations of a distorted past makes life very difficult for this and the next generation of GPs. So let's take a more dispassionate look at the realities behind these stories. Like my father, Pickles would take his daughter on home visits too. There's a record of him taking his daughter to visit a dying woman, both Pickles and the girl en route to a ball. By taking their daughters on home visits, both Pickles and my father could be accused of putting their needs and those of their family ahead of their patients, even of showing off. Nowadays, the idea of a GP taking a child with them on a visit to a dying patient is unimaginable. Pickles was most clinically active during the 1950s, a time when general practice was heavily criticised by a major report called the Collins Report. Collins surveyed 55 randomly chosen practices and reported finding practices with minute consulting rooms, with no chair for the patient and no couch for an examination, queues extending 200 yards waiting to see the GP, a practice of 4 principals and an assistant seeing 500 patients per day, and proud of it, waiting rooms where patients had to stand for hours before being seen for 5 minutes. And the Taylor Report, which was published in 1954, found wide discrepancies in the quality of care provided by GPs, and a stark contrast between what constituted a good GP and a bad GP. Taylor described a GP to be avoided as stupid, smarmy, pompous, bad-tempered, obstinate, refuses to admit mistakes, skimps work, shows emotional instability with credulous self-pity, and abuse of patients and society. So not surprisingly, these two reports were received by the profession with anger and denial, much as we receive our CQC inspections today. And I'm sure my father's practice would have come in for severe criticism too. When he moved it to a 2-up, 2-down converted terraced house in the 1970s, I was in my teens, and I used to work for him as a Saturday receptionist, offering cigarettes to patients as they waited hours to see him. Absolutely true. The patient's lavatory was situated behind the only consulting room, so when in need, the patients had to walk through, interrupting the consultation. And the sound of their bodily discharges were clearly audible to us all, even in the waiting room. Now, by the mid-1970s, the Royal College of General Practitioners was beginning to have an influence on general practice, even in Peterborough. But not in the way that you might imagine. When my father decided to take on a new partner, I remember him rapidly sifting through a mound of applications and separating them into 2 piles. And I asked him what the piles meant, and he said the first was for those with MRCGP, and the second for those without. And he went on to reject all of those in the first pile. The new kind of doctor, being promoted by the college, one specifically trained and qualified to deliver high-quality general practice, was clearly seen as a threat to my father. And what about John Sassel, the heroic GP protagonist of A Fortunate Man? Was he a desirable role model? Like many of the doctors I see in my practitioner health service, being a doctor meant everything to him. So much so that he blurred the boundaries between his professional and his personal life, creating a hybrid identity, an amalgam of these 2 persona, which I call the medical self, a single identity. This medical self, the merging of the professional and the personal, could be thought of as the essence of vocation. As one doctor attending my service told me, being a medic is not just a job that you go to, it is something you are. I can no more take the doctor out of me than an artist can take their creativity out of them. And I believe that it is this medical self which acts during our work to mask our suffering and protects us from subjective feelings of guilt, fear, and hopelessness. But this can and often does get out of hand, especially when not counterbalanced by a healthy working environment or personal support. Sassel, like so many doctors attending my service, defined himself by his work. And when his long-term practice partner died, instead of acquiring a new one, he chose to split the list and instead run the practice single-handedly. Burgess' book even describes how Sassel longed to be woken up at night to do house calls. He was incapable of doing nothing and just being. Put simply, Sassel was a workaholic. He also suffered from regular bouts of depression, which affected his ability to do his job properly. At one point in the book, Burgess even questioned Sassel's fitness to practice. Sadly, after the death of his wife, things became too much for Sassel, and eventually he took his own life. Which brings me back to the subject of mental illness in doctors. In recent years, as I've said, much of my time has been taken up running the Practitioner Health Service. Initially only for doctors living in London, the service has now been extended to cover all GPs and all GP trainees in England. And as you've heard, that means around 85,000 doctors can access our service, and around 1,000 do so per year. That it exists at all is an acknowledgement by NHS England that doctors, and in particular GPs, are important. It's unique in that it's run by me, a GP, leading a national network of over 100 psychiatrists, mental health nurses, GPs and therapists. Doctors refer themselves, and we in turn give them the gift of time, a confidential space and care to get better. And once in treatment, our patients have remarkably good outcomes. Nearly 80% of those with addiction are abstinent at 6 months, and this remains the case for up to 5 years and later. For all patients, improvements are substantial in areas of mental health, social functioning, numbers returning to work or training, and a reduction in the involvement of the regulator. It's a very successful programme. But across all ages, in all health systems, private or public, in all countries, and across all specialties, it turns out doctors have higher rates of mental illness than an age-matched population, and the rate is increasing. There are many reasons for this, and let's have a look at some of them. From our first day at medical school, we become special, different, and we begin to connect with a family of medicine, past and present. And our specialness is reinforced during our training, as the distance between us and our non-medical peers widens, something that's inevitable considering our more onerous and longer training. As doctors, we learn together, play together, work together, live together, and even love together, as many of us form lifelong relationships with other doctors, myself included. As we train, doctors learn a new scientific language, and symbolically, our new medical identity is reinforced through dress, the white coat, albeit worn less and less, and especially through the acquisition of a new title, Doctor. With its strict hierarchies, its expectations around behaviour, both in and out of work, and our professional solidarity, medicine sets us apart from others. And in the process, our medical self, that coalition of our professional and personal identities, becomes enmeshed in our group of belonging, that is medicine. And the connections formed by this group are vital if we're to survive a lifetime exposed to death, despair and disability. They protect us, sustain us and support us. But this group also determines its own norms, which in turn dictates certain behaviours. Amongst these norms is the idea that we do not become sick. It is patients on the other side of the consulting room or the other side of the needle who become unwell, not doctors, which explains in part why it's so difficult for a doctor to take on the patient role when they're unwell. In his posthumous memoir, When Breath Becomes Air, the neurosurgeon Paul Carnathy wonders, why was I so authoritative in a surgeon's coat, but so meek in a patient's gown? It's because as the complete object, the doctor, we create an aura of invisibility around ourselves. We wear magic coats. We destroy disease all the time. How can it attack us? We're simply not good at being patients ourselves. But there are other reasons why doctors are more at risk. Doctors occupy a privileged position in society. We have status, expertise, and considerable power, though less perhaps than in Pickles' day. We're granted access to the most intimate and secret parts of our patients' lives. But with these privileges come darker consequences. Patients confide in us. They tell us things that they wouldn't tell anyone else, not even their closest friends or the members of their family. And this can be a tremendous burden for us. We enter the swampy lowlands with our patients, a place of confusing messes incapable of technical solutions, as Donald Schwann puts it. To survive a lifetime in medicine, we develop strategies to suppress our emotions by shoring up our psychological defences. But these defences do not buy us psychological immunity. And ironically, the personality traits which make us good doctors, obsessiveness, perfectionism, even narcissism, can, when our backs are against the wall, turn into a compulsive triad of doubt, guilt, and an exaggerated sense of responsibility. On top of this, there's also the huge weight of expectation laid upon us by politicians and policymakers, especially for GPs who are seen both as the saviour and the scapegoat of the NHS. Despite ever-dwindling resources and constant reorganisations, our political masters act as though we can somehow magically protect the public from illness and even death. And the response of many of us to impossible challenges like this is to do what we've been trained to do, push ourselves even harder, but risking burnout and mental illness. Now, there is a sense that the increase in mental illness that we're seeing at the moment is due to this current generation not being resilient enough and not being as resilient as previous ones, somehow lacking the required stiff upper lip. I've heard that so many times. What I do know, and what I've learnt from evidence and experience, is that doctors past and present are amongst the most resilient individuals in society. We can go long hours without sleep, food, bathroom breaks. We even have resilient bladders. Given the right support, doctors survive and thrive in the face of adversity. Resilience is about bending with pressure and bouncing back. But given the wrong circumstances, each one of us has our breaking point, beyond which we can go no further. And it was always thus. Earlier at my home this year, we had a flood in our basement. And as I was cleaning up the mess, I came across an old Mosely Gazette. These were written in the old days. I flicked through the pages, wondering why I'd kept this tattered, battered, and now very wet copy. And in it, I found an article I'd written in 1989. Now, at the time, I'd switched from psychiatry to general practice, which meant spending 6 months in obstetrics and gynecology as a junior hospital doctor at University College Hospital. Hello, Anthony and Katrina. Thank you for being here. Now, the article described my experience of these 6 months. Looking back, before I read this article, my memories of this period had been incredibly happy ones, of comradeship between colleagues, fun at work, and love. Or so I thought. The article was called Lest We Forget. And in the centre of it was a photo of 4 junior doctors, myself and 3 others. The caption between the photo read, "Juniors launch fund to fight Hours case in court." One of us, Chris Johnson, was suing his health authority over excessive duty hours, and he needed to raise £20,000 to take the case to court, an early form of crowdsourcing. Now, in the piece, I described my shock at working such long hours. I wrote of the unremitting nights on call and their devastating impact on myself and my colleagues. We couldn't sleep. We couldn't concentrate. We found little to enjoy in life. And like many of my peers at the time, I blamed myself for not being able to cope. And this is what I wrote. For the first time, I understood the process where junior doctors could become so depressed as to take their own lives, sometimes performing the act in their own on-call room. I was deeply shocked to see I'd written this, and reading it reminded me how important it is that we face up to the reality of our past and not gloss over the bits that caused us pain. I believe that the rise in mental illness amongst doctors is made worse by the older generation, my generation, clinging to a distorted past of a golden age that never was. A mythologised past places an enormous burden of unrealistic expectations on the shoulders of the current generation of GPs. My generation reminisce about continuity of care, partnerships, and the freedom to do what we have felt right for patients, unconstrained by the demands of a marketised healthcare system. And it's true, it was like that. But what we don't mention was the paternalism or the patronage. You got on largely by who you knew, not what you knew. We don't mention the bullying, the long hours, and as how junior doctors, we were left unsupported, expected to do most of the work on our own. I worry that many young GPs make a valiant but futile attempt to live up to an impossible standard, measuring themselves against medical heroes like Pickles and Sassel, who on closer inspection are revealed to have feet of clay. Facing up to the realities of our profession's past helps us to see that those who came before us were no better, nor worse, no worse than we are today. Today, though, as our workload grows heavier and its complexity and intensity increases, it's all too easy to feel that general practice is in crisis. But if you look back over the history of our profession, as I've done, it's clear that GPs have often found themselves trying to do their best against a background of cuts and disruptive reorganisations. Through the generations, the profession has adapted, and this is what we are doing now, today. For example, recently, like many of you, I've had to move around and consult with strangers, with patients that I will only ever meet once. I was recently asked to work at a practice I'd never worked in before. The resident GP had gone off sick, and at short notice, I was asked to cover his evening surgery. It was already getting dark when I arrived at the practice. It'd been pouring with rain. I was cold and I was wet, but I was strangely excited. I knew that the tools of my trade were in me. I was confident that despite never having worked in this practice, never having met any of the patients or staff, I would know what to do. And over the next 4 hours, I weaved in and out of strangers' lives. I listened to their stories of distress, a bereavement, and joy, a woman becoming pregnant after years of infertility. I reassured the young that their symptoms were normal, and I saw the old and the very old. I consulted with patients face to face, on the phone, and via the web. I didn't just cope or survive, I thrived, as the next generation will do too. At the end of my shift, I experienced the profound satisfaction and joy at a job well done. As I engaged with each individual patient, I felt I'd known them, their families and their communities for all of my life. During our brief encounters, they had made as much a difference to me as I hope I had to them. Pickles, Sassel and my father lived where they worked and stayed put for most of their working lives. The relationships they built up with their patients were often lifelong. For much of my working life, the same could be said of me too. But it will not be the same for the next generation. Today, people are more mobile and spend more of their lives in the virtual world, expecting instant and round-the-clock services. The new kind of doctor will have to be trained to adapt to these changing expectations, not with the 3 years training we have now, or even 4 years, which was agreed when I was your chair, but I hope with 5 years. Because extended training will bring more opportunities and increase confidence for tomorrow's doctors. The job I started out in 35 years ago is different than it is today. Of course it is. These days it's faster, more litigious and more regulated. But it is also safer, more equal and more varied. And it offers general practitioners far more opportunities. And it may surprise you when I say that despite the difficulties we currently face, I believe there has never been a more exciting time to be a GP. Your future will be one where the relationship between doctors and patients will be more equal, one in which patients are more involved, but also more responsible for their own health. Social media will play an ever greater part in the way doctors and patients communicate, creating a less formal, more democratised relationship involving new ways of delivering care, via TweetDeck or CrowdMed, for example. Genomics will take off, heralding the era of truly personalised medicine. The new kind of doctor will have to learn how to decipher and translate this information for patients, something we GPs, with our ability to manage risk, deal with uncertainty, and care for our patients holistically, are skilled at. The digital revolution will mean increasing numbers of consultations will be virtual, as are mine, or involve artificial intelligence. Our challenge will be to ensure this becomes our servant, not our master. These are just some of the few momentous changes that we're already having to come to terms with, but there will be many more we can't even anticipate. But if we're going to prevail in the shifting sands of the future, doctors will have to challenge some of the assumptions we, the older generation, have made on their behalf. We teach doctors to make the patient their first concern. Indeed, this is the first on the General Medical Council's list of the duties of the doctor. And further, the Geneva Declaration, which doctors now sign up to when they enter the profession, begins with a solemn pledge to consecrate my life to the service of humanity. Of course, doctors shall always act honestly, compassionately, and avoid conflicts of interest. But is it reasonable to ask newly qualified doctors to consecrate their life to the service of humanity? It's a very big ask. I spoke before about my dad, Sassel and Pickles, who typified the myth of the saintly, self-sacrificing doctor. I believe this image is getting in the way and in danger of damaging the next generation of doctors. We need a new definition of vocation, adapted to the times we live in, one that reflects the fact that we're all human beings trying to do our best for patients. I talked earlier about the medical self being enmeshed in our group of belonging, and how important these spaces and connections are, but they are in serious danger of disappearing. Spaces such as the practice team, the firm, the mess. The new kind of doctor must create their own new spaces and connections if they're to survive a lifetime in medicine. If we expect doctors to give their all to others, then the quid pro quo is that we have to protect the doctor and the connections which sustain them. And I think this means recreating their groups of belonging, protected spaces where they can learn, work, cry, suffer, and celebrate together, free from the clutter of inspection, assessment, or monitoring. My work with sick doctors has taught me an important lesson. To survive a lifetime in the fast and furious world of modern healthcare, it's vitally important that we take good care of ourselves. This is not about denying the needs of the patient, but self-sacrifice is no longer an option. It's bad for doctors, and what's bad for doctors is bad for patients. Making that extra visit or seeing that extra patient is fine in a crisis, but when the system demands too much, the doctor of the future must be encouraged to say no more. The new kind of doctor must think about their own needs if they're going to be able to do their best for their patients. The new kind of doctor must expect to be trained and to work in an environment where the demands placed upon them do not make them unwell. And when we do become unwell, it's no longer acceptable to blame us and to patch us up and send us back to the battlefield, expecting us to get on with it. Looking after doctors with mental health problems has shown me a different side of medicine. And although it can be upsetting to face the reality of the suffering that some doctors go through, It's also inspiring to watch as they come through it and recover and return to health and back to work, as most of my patients do. The myths of our profession do little to help those who find themselves in turmoil. In truth, they make things worse by promoting unrealistic expectations of what a good doctor should be. Of course, we must take the best of the past, but we can only move our profession forward by looking to the future. It's time for us to tell and share stories that reflect the reality of our profession, both good and bad. And it's time for us to tell stories that look forward to challenging and exciting future, not ones that hark back to a golden age that never was. Thank you. I can't stand. Thank you very much.
I can relax now. Claire has made it down the stairs without falling over. That's good. Thank you. Thank you, Claire. Certainly food for thought. Today's lecture has been videoed and will shortly be available on YouTube. There will now be a tea break outside, and then please could you join us for our awards and fellowship ceremony beginning promptly at 4:15, which is in about half an hour's time. There will be a seating plan for the next part of the ceremony, so please take any personal belongings with you because you won't be in the same chairs when you come back. So myself and Claire are going to go outside, and we look forward to seeing you outside. Thank you.